Can you hear that sound? It's not the distinctive ping of the M1 Garand rifle, carried by millions of American soldiers during World War II, nor is it the sharp crack of the Arisaka rifle from the Japanese side. What you're hearing is the report of a hunting rifle, a civilian weapon. Just a few weeks earlier, commanding officers scoffed at it, calling it a toy. They questioned its owner, asking, "Are you planning to hunt deer or Nazis with that thing?" But at 9:17 a.m. on January 22, 1943, in a crumbling bunker on Guadalcanal, that laughter fell silent, because the man holding that rifle, Lieutenant John George, was about to demonstrate something that the U.S. military had seemingly forgotten. In an industrial war where tons of bombs are dropped every day, sometimes all it takes to change the outcome is one man, a deep breath, and a single bullet. Welcome to WW2 Diaries channel. Today we won't be discussing generals or battles involving millions. Instead, we will delve into the story of a hunter who found himself on the battlefield and how his mail-order gun became a nightmare for Japanese snipers. The air on Guadalcanal was not merely hot. It was a physical weight. It was a suffocating blanket of humidity, rotting vegetation, and the copper tang of spilled blood that seemed to hang permanently in the canopy. By January 1943, the island had become a grinding mill of human meat. The United States Marines had taken the airfield, but the United States Army was now tasked with rooting out what remained in the dense, claustrophobic groves west of the Matanikau River. In this industrial slaughterhouse where artillery churned the earth and heavy machine guns sawed down trees, Second Lieutenant John B. George was an anomaly. He was a glitch in the military matrix. While the men of the 132nd Infantry Regiment carried the M1 Garand, the pinnacle of semi-automatic military engineering, designed to fire 8 rounds in rapid succession, George carried a relic of a different world. It was a Winchester Model 70, a bolt-action sporting rifle, a weapon designed for the quiet patience of a deer stand in Illinois, not the chaotic hell of the South Pacific. His fellow officers had laughed. They called it a mail-order sweetheart. They called it a toy. They asked him, with the sneering cynicism of men who had seen too much death, whether he intended to hunt stags or soldiers. The armorer at Camp Forest in Tennessee had looked at the delicate glass of the Lyman Alaskan scope and the polished wood of the stock and shook his head, wondering how such a fragile thing could survive a week in the mud. But as the sun rose over the Point Cruz groves on January 22, 1943, the laughter had died. The 132nd Regiment was bleeding. They were dying in the creek beds. They were dying on the trails. They were dying from bullets fired by men they could not see, Japanese ghosts tied into the high branches of the banyan trees, invisible, silent, and lethal. The battalion commander, desperate and losing men faster than replacements could arrive, had turned to the man with the toy rifle. The ultimatum was simple: stop them, or throw that damn thing away. John George sat in the ruins of a Japanese bunker, wiped the sweat from his eyes, and chambered a round of .30-06 hunting ammunition. The war of mass production was over. The hunt had begun. To understand the miracle that occurred at Point Cruz, one must first understand the man and the machine. John George was not a typical soldier. At 27 years old, he was the Illinois state champion marksman. He was a student of ballistics, a man who understood windage, mirage, and the microscopic variables that dictate the flight of a bullet. He did not view shooting as an act of violence, but as a problem of mathematics and physiology, while his peers were drilled to provide suppressing fire, shooting in the general direction of the enemy to keep their heads down. George believed in the one-shot, one-kill philosophy. Before it became a military slogan, he had saved 2 years of his National Guard pay to purchase the Winchester Model 70. He had spent hundreds of hours at Camp Perry, polishing the trigger mechanism until it broke at exactly 3.5 pounds with the crispness of a glass rod snapping. The weapon was an extension of his nervous system. The rifle, a Winchester Model 70, .30-06 caliber. The scope, a Lyman Alaskan, 2.5x magnification. The ammo, 180 grain soft-point hunting rounds brought from home because he didn't trust military ball ammunition to be consistent enough for precision work. On the morning of January 22nd, George was not looking for a target. He was looking for an anomaly. The jungle is a chaotic tapestry of shapes and shadows, but it follows rules. Leaves move with the wind, branches sway in rhythm. At Aero 917, George saw something that broke the rules. Through the low magnification scope, which offered a wide field of view, perfect for the dense jungle, he scanned a banyan tree 240 yards away. The jungle was noisy, a cacophony of birds and insects, but George's world was silent. He saw a branch move against the wind, then a shape. It was a Japanese sniper, positioned in a fork 87 feet above the jungle floor. The enemy soldier was dressed in dark clothing, blending perfectly with the bark. He was facing east, watching the American supply trail, waiting for a careless soldier to expose himself. George adjusted his position. He didn't just aim, he built a platform, bone-on-bone support, breath control. He inhaled, exhaled halfway, and paused. The crosshairs settled on the dark patch in the tree. The Winchester's trigger broke. The report was sharp, distinctively different from the crack-pow of the Garand's. 240 yards away, physics took over. The bullet struck the sniper. The man jerked violently, his grip on the tree failing. He plummeted 90 feet, crashing through the canopy, his body hitting the ground with a thud that was felt rather than heard. George did not cheer. He cycled the bolt. Clack, clack. The brass casing spun out, steaming in the humid air. He pushed a fresh round into the chamber and settled back into the scope. He knew what the others didn't. Japanese snipers worked in teams. Where there was a shooter, there was a spotter. 26 minutes later, the spotter moved. He was in a different tree, 60 yards north, trying to descend, trying to flee the position that had been compromised. George tracked him. He led the target, aiming slightly ahead of the movement to allow the bullet to arrive at the same time as the man. He fired. The second man fell backward, his rifle clattering through the branches. 2 shots, 2 kills. The toy had drawn first blood. News of George's success spread through the battalion like wildfire. The men who had mocked him now looked at the Winchester with reverence. They called it the professor's gun, but George knew that the element of surprise was a wasting asset. The Japanese were masters of jungle warfare. They would realize that the Americans had brought a specialist into the field. By the afternoon of the second day, the dynamic of the battlefield had shifted. The Japanese snipers, realizing they were being hunted, stopped moving entirely during daylight hours. They became statues. Then they began to hunt him back. On January 23rd, after George had recorded his 6th kill, the Japanese triangulated his position. They couldn't see him, but they could hear the distinct report of his rifle. At 09:57, mortar rounds began to walk toward his position. Whoomp, crash, 40 yards short. Whoomp, crash, 20 yards short. George grabbed his rifle and ammo pouches and sprinted. He dove into a shell crater, just as the 3rd salvo obliterated the bunker he had been sitting in seconds before. He lay in the mud, panting, debris raining down on his helmet. This was no longer a turkey shoot. It was a duel. The next morning, January 24th, brought the ultimate test. It was a scenario that would be studied in sniper schools for decades to come. George had relocated to a cluster of rocks, 70 yards south of his previous position. At 08:17, he spotted a Japanese sniper in a palm tree, 190 yards away. But something was wrong. The sniper was low, only 40 feet up. He was poorly concealed. The palm fronds offered scant cover. George's finger tightened on the trigger, but his brain screamed, "Stop!" Why would a veteran sniper, a man who had survived weeks of combat, choose such a terrible position? Why would he expose himself so blatantly? George lowered the rifle. He wiped sweat from his brow. He understood the game. It was bait. The man in the palm tree was a sacrificial pawn. He was there to be shot. The moment George fired at him, the muzzle flash would reveal George's position to the real sniper, the master hunter, who was undoubtedly hidden nearby, waiting for the American to take the bait. George began to scan the trees around the palm. He moved his scope inch by inch, ignoring the easy target. It took 11 agonizing minutes. Then he found him, 80 yards northwest of the bait, in a massive banyan tree, 91 feet up. The master sniper was encased in a fortress of vines. He wasn't watching the trail. He was watching the rocks where George was hiding. He was waiting for the muzzle flash. George was trapped. If he shot the bait, the master would kill him. If he shot the master, The master might fire a reflex shot, or the bait might spot him. He formulated a plan that relied on human instinct. George aimed at the bait in the palm tree. He fired. The decoy crumbled and fell. George did not wait to verify the kill. The millisecond the gun recoiled, he racked the bolt with violent speed and swung the barrel toward the master sniper's tree. He was banking on the fact that the sound of the shot and the sight of his partner falling would cause the master sniper to flinch, to turn his head, to shift his body. It worked. Through the scope, George saw the vines shift. The master sniper had turned to look at his falling comrade. That movement betrayed him. George fired his second shot. The master sniper collapsed, his body hanging limp in the vines before sliding free and plummeting to the earth. Checkmate. But silence did not follow. As George climbed out of the mud to retrieve his brass, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. Voices. Not the chirping of birds, but guttural, urgent Japanese commands. He dropped back into the water-filled shell crater. He submerged himself until only his eyes and the bridge of his nose were above the surface, holding the Winchester vertical to keep the barrel dry. Through the murky water, he listened. A patrol, infantry. They weren't snipers. They were a recovery team coming for the bodies. He counted at least 6 voices. At 10:28, the voices stopped moving toward the trees and started moving toward him. They had found his boot prints in the mud. George had 5 rounds left in the magazine. There were 6 men approaching. The math was fatal. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the rim of the crater, looking down into the water. His eyes locked with George's. George didn't hesitate. He rose from the water like a swamp creature. Crack. The soldier fell backward. George worked the bolt while still waist-deep in the water. Clack, clack. 2 more soldiers appeared at the rim, rifles raised. Crack. 1 down. Clack, clack, crack. The second one crumbled. 3 infantrymen dead in 4 seconds. But his position was overrun. Bullets began to churn the water around him. George scrambled out of the north side of the crater, mud sucking at his boots. He didn't run like a sniper now. He ran like a terrified animal. He sprinted 20 yards, dove behind a fallen log as bullets shredded the bark above his head. He fired one last shot at a pursuing shadow, a suppressing shot, and ran again. He ran until his lungs burned. He ran until the Japanese voices faded into the distance. When he finally reached the American perimeter at 11:13, he wasn't just tired, he was empty. He had fired his last rounds during the escape. The toy rifle was battered, the stock scratched, the barrel steaming. He had gone into the jungle a marksman. He had come out a survivor. By the end of the 4th day, John George had killed 11 Japanese snipers. He had fired 12 rounds. He had cleared the Point Cruz groves of the threat that had paralyzed an entire regiment. But the most significant moment of the campaign happened not in the jungle, but in the command tent. Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander, looked at the exhausted lieutenant. He looked at the mud-caked Winchester. "Can you teach my men to do that?" Ferry asked. "I can try," George replied, "but I need the right men, and I need the right tools." The Army didn't have Winchester Model 70s, but the Marines had left behind crates of Springfield M1903 rifles, equipped with inertial 8X scopes. They were heavy, clunky, and old, but they were accurate. George selected 40 men. He didn't pick the bravest or the strongest. He picked the ones who had qualified as expert marksmen on the range. He took them to a makeshift range behind the lines and began the first impromptu sniper school of the Pacific War. He taught them that shooting was only 10% of the job. The other 90% was discipline. He taught them to use field expedients, resting the rifle on a log, a rock, or a sling, because in combat, you never get a perfect prone position. He introduced the concept of the 2-man team, a shooter with a scoped rifle and a spotter with a semi-automatic M1 Garand and binoculars. The spotter found the targets and protected the shooter. The shooter delivered the surgical strike. On February 1st, George took his students into the field. The results were terrifyingly effective. In the span of a few weeks, George's sniper section recorded 74 confirmed kills. American casualties during these operations? 0. They had industrialized the art of the precision kill. They had turned the jungle from a place of fear into a hunting ground. If Guadalcanal was the triumph of the individual marksman, Burma was the graveyard of romanticism. After the victory at Guadalcanal, George was recruited for a top-secret unit, the 5307th Composite Unit, provisional, better known to history as Merrill's Marauders. Their mission was suicide, to march hundreds of miles behind enemy lines in Burma, cut off Japanese supply routes, and capture the airfield at Myitkyina. George packed his Winchester, but he modified it. The war was changing. He stripped off the heavy wooden stock and replaced it with a lighter synthetic version. He removed the Lyman, Alaskan scope, and replaced it with a lighter Weaver model. Every ounce mattered when you had to carry your life on your back over the Himalayan foothills. But Burma was different. The vegetation was so thick that visibility was often measured in feet, not yards. The dampness, wrought leather and rusted steel overnight. In 3 months of brutal combat, trekking 700 miles through mountains and monsoon rains, George fired his beloved Winchester only 3 times. The engagements in Burma were fierce, sudden, and close. They were ambushes at 20 yards. They were firefights where volume of fire, the sheer ability to spray lead into the bush, mattered more than surgical precision. George found himself reaching for a Thompson submachine gun, or a carbine more often than his bolt-action rifle. Yet on 3 occasions, the old magic returned. Once, at a river crossing, a Japanese officer stood carelessly on a bank, directing troops. The range was 412 yards. The Marauders' carbines couldn't reach him. George unslung the Winchester. He calculated the drop. He fired. The officer fell. The Japanese troops scattered, terrified by a death that seemed to come from nowhere. But these moments were rare. By the time the Marauders reached Myitkyina, the unit had disintegrated. Men were dying of typhus, dysentery, and exhaustion. The sport of sniping had been replaced by the grim struggle for survival. George realized that, while the sniper would always have a place in war, the era of the gentleman hunter was over. The future belonged to semi-automatic precision, to volume, to technology. John George survived the war. He returned to the United States a decorated hero, a lieutenant colonel with 2 Bronze Stars, but he did not seek the limelight. He was a quiet man, an intellectual. He went to Princeton. He went to Oxford. He became a diplomat in Africa. In 1947, he sat down to write. He did not write a boastful memoir of how many men he had killed. He wrote a technical manual disguised as a narrative. His book, Shots Fired in Anger, became a classic, not because it was thrilling, but because it was honest. He wrote about the failures of equipment. He wrote about the rot of the jungle. He wrote about the respect he held for the Japanese soldier, who he described as the toughest infantryman on earth. He kept the rifle. The Winchester Model 70, serial number 48638, sat in his home for decades. It was a silent witness to history. It had traveled from the cornfields of Illinois to the coral ridges of Guadalcanal, to the mountains of Burma, and back to the quiet suburbs of America. John George died in 2009, at the age of 90. Before he passed, he donated the rifle to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. If you go there today, you can see it. It sits behind glass, bathed in soft museum light. To the casual observer, it looks like an old hunting rifle. The bluing is worn off the bolt handle from thousands of cycles. The stock has scratches from the coral rocks of Point Cruz. But if you lean in close, you can almost smell the cosmoline. You can almost hear the crack of the shot that silenced the banyan trees. It stands as a testament to a specific moment in history, a moment when the outcome of a battle turned not on the size of the army, but on the skill of a single man, breathing slowly, waiting for the wind to die down. It is no longer a mail-order sweetheart. It is the Excalibur of the Pacific, and it rests now, its work finally done.